Florida technically was not a part of the American Revolution. We were not one of the 13 colonies. And yet, as the more we looked at it and realized the number of different ethnic and cultural groups living in Florida during that period, in fact, 2 centuries longer than the Revolution was even thought of, we were here. And among those people were the Spanish, the indigenous people, Africans, Minorcans, and the British. We decided to throw the British in there in the end, the British loyalists who kept our American patriots imprisoned here during the war. So that will be our final lecture, which will be on May 21st. We cordially invite you to return to impact by Florida and on Florida, and particularly on these various ethnic cultures. So tonight we are going to learn about the Minorcan people. And at our museum we find that most of our visitors, and of course many of them are tourists and not from the area, but we do have locals, and many of them are unfamiliar with the Minorcan history. And so our goal, particularly tonight, but going forward, is to teach those unknown stories, share the unknown stories of what the Minorcans have done in the city of St. Augustine. Today, 1 in 10 of the residents of St. Augustine can claim a direct descendancy from those original New Smyrna residents. So that's pretty exciting. And what their ancestors brought to St. Augustine were amazing skills and crafts that actually made St. Augustine the town and city that it is today. So I'm excited this evening to give you an unannounced, unofficial, special announcement of a save the date, because next year, 2027, marks the 250th anniversary of the Minorcan Flight to Freedom, which you're going to hear about tonight, from New Smyrna. 400 to 700 people walking 70 miles from New Smyrna to St. Augustine. So next year, the year will be the year of the Minorcans. We have the great honor of working with New Smyrna and the Museum of History there. And we will have some very special dignitaries, hopefully coming from Minorca, who will be joining us over a 2-week period. What the Colonial Dames Ximenez-Fatio House is offering to entertain these guests, among the many other events you will begin to hear about, is we are going to have an authentic 1770s Minorcan Market Day. We will have Minorcan descendants in most part, demonstrating the various skills and crafts such as wrought iron making, lace making, indigo production, weaving, basket weaving, all kinds. We have 10 vendors so far who have agreed to come and demonstrate these skills as part of a market that you can pretend you're a Minorcan resident coming to market to buy your household goods. We will also have a food demonstration, and you will be able to taste up to 7 different Minorcan specialties, from chowder to daddle jam to fromaggiata spread, if I said that right, and several others, including the Italian and Greek people who also made up the Minorcan community. So that will be on March the 19th at the Ximenez-Fatio House. So once again, save the date. But there will be several other special events all during the spring, both in New Smyrna and St. Augustine. And we look forward to having your participation in all of that. And in addition, we are very fortunate, the Flagler College Department of Humanities has offered to do a special production, if you will, in the courtyard. They will stage Minorcan videos of the island, songs, poetry, history, stories, etc. And that will be ongoing during the day, and it will be scheduled. So if you want to hear songs, you can come at a certain hour, but it will be ongoing throughout the festival. And we're very pleased that they've agreed to take care of all that. We're excited about it. So now, it is my honor this evening to welcome tonight's presenters. We have Greg Holbrook, who is the Executive Director of the New Smyrna Museum of History, and Dr. Darien Andreu, Professor Emeritus of English from Flagler College, who is also a Minorcan. So thank you both for agreeing to join us and share your knowledge and expertise. So Greg, I believe you're going to start, if you would like.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's an honor and privilege to be here with you tonight. I was introduced with the phrase expertise. And, you know, Mark Twain described an expert as a guy from out of town. And I am certainly that. I am certainly a guy from out of town, from New Smyrna. And it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. Just a little brief history of our organization and how we evolved, because actually the story of the Turnbull settlement and the Minorcan people end up being a big part of the story of our historical society and its development. It's so wonderful to be in a city that celebrates its history and its heritage and preserves it the way that the city of St. Augustine does, because that does not necessarily exist everywhere in the state of Florida. Volusia County is not known for being a leader in historic preservation here in the state. As a matter of fact, the city of New Smyrna Beach is first approached and encouraged to recognize its own history by the American Hellenic Education and Progressive Association. Back in 1968, they approached the city of New Smyrna and encouraged them to embrace the community's history, and they do end up developing a 3-day festival at that point in time to recognize the beginnings of what was New Smyrna, originally named Smyrna, which they said was bad Greek for New Smyrna, as it was established back in those days. Our historical society isn't actually registered with the state of Florida for almost 2 decades later. It's the early 1980s when members of the community first formed the Southeast Volusia Historical Society. They get their first museum space in the early 90s, and as it turns out, right around 1990 was also the point in time that a self-taught volunteer archaeologist named Dorothy Moore, known as Dot Moore, knows that if the Turnbull settlement exists like everyone says that it did, that somewhere along the shores of New Smyrna there's evidence. And she finds and documents, partnered with Dr. Roger Grange, the Professor Emeritus of the Anthropology Department of the University of South Florida, they document the first settler's home site that was ever found there in New Smyrna. Fortunately, Dr. Grange is connected with the state. He gets the state's archaeologist involved. There's 3 major surveys over the next 8 years, and they identify 30 of the original settlers' home sites and start to get an archaeological picture of what that might have looked like. Then, in the early 2000s, the museum moves from its initial small museum in Old Fort Park. They get control of the first post office building that was established in New Smyrna to be our museum, and they established the New Smyrna Museum of History. And that's roughly around the same time that an archive in Dundee, Scotland reaches out through the US State Department and contacts us and says, we have some letters and maps that were part of the Duncan family archives here in Dundee. And we learned that what they have are Andrew Turnbull's handwritten letters and a map that was sent back to Sir William Duncan, basically reporting on how Turnbull was spending all of his money. And so it brings together documentary evidence and ties it with the archaeological evidence that had been developed. The Southeast Volusia Historical Society that runs our museum goes to the state and they get a grant and solicit academics to help them establish the Turnbull Settlement Exhibit, which is the central exhibit in our museum there at the New Smyrna Museum of History. And it's awarded by Florida's Trust for Historic Preservation in 2007, recognizing how they were able to document and represent that story that plays out, this big story that actually plays out in 9 years. And so I'm humbled to be here with you because not only am I a guy from out of town, I'm also not a Minorcan. I'm a transplant here to Florida that's gotten involved with the museum through a background of developing historic narration and presentation. I served as a volunteer for many years on their board of directors for 6, as president for 3, and I have been the executive director there at the New Smyrna Museum of History for the last 8 years. And I want to thank Payson for inviting us to be here with you tonight to share our little piece of the story. As you know, it's not really the happy part of the story, if you know this story very well. The more I've learned and studied about the Turnbull settlement and the Minorcan people, I've learned that there's really multiple facets to who they are today. There are the story of who they were as a culture before they ever came here. And the story of the island of Minorca is so huge in its own cultural history. And then there's this settlement story that shapes who they are here in North America. But then after that, they become a St. Augustine story and an American story as they evolve into the community here in St. Augustine and into becoming American citizens. Someone a lot smarter than me once said that history isn't the study of the past. It's actually the study of how things change through time. And it was things changing during time that brought about the conditions that allowed Great Britain to get control of the peninsula of Florida and established the 14th and 15th U.S. British colonies here in North America, British East Florida and British West Florida at that point in time. It happens as a result of the end of the 7 Years' War. And if you are a wealthy, connected to the crown individual, when your country makes these types of advances, it means opportunity. And that's exactly what it equaled to Dr. Andrew Turnbull and the people that he knew. His main investor was the physician to King George, Sir William Duncan, and so they're looking at the Crown's offer of 20,000 acre land grants to establish agricultural production areas in British East Florida. All they've got to do is figure out how to pay to get people there, recruit people. They need a specific number of people, 500, to populate specific size parcels of land. And of course, they also have to agree to raise specific crops to support the British trade efforts and send that stuff back to Europe. Turnbull actually, I'm sorry, I get a little ahead here. There's also brought forward at the same time as they're talking about this, someone writes a paper and brings forward a Greek idea, which Turnbull, who's married to a Greek woman, he's been very well traveled. He's been to Smyrna where he met his wife Gracia, and he really attaches to this. But the paper that's written talks about how Greek and Mediterranean people are going to be the best people to bring to East Florida because they're hardworking people who will fight for what's theirs and protect their own land. They're mostly sober people as well, and most importantly, they're not Catholic. Right? They're Greek Orthodox, and that really appealed to the British at that time. Now, Turnbull makes his first visit, arriving here in St. Augustine in 1766. And there's a slide of him and his wife. The one photograph that we know, or painting that exists of Andrew Turnbull, he's a physician, so it's said his hand is on a skull to represent his eternal quest for knowledge in that painting. He visits in 1766, and he picks the next inlet south of the Matanzas at the encouragement of the British surveyors and Governor Grant here in British East Florida. They actually make a trip down and visit that area. Turnbull writes about how ideal this place is going to be. It's November. It's beautiful. He talks about how they make a makeshift table and dine on a raccoon. before they come back to St. Augustine, and he's really idealistic about how great this is going to work and how this is going to work not only on behalf of the investors, but also on behalf of the people that he feels are going to join him. And he's quite confident in his ability to recruit the Greek people that he thinks he's going to need, this minimum of 500 people that he's going to need to actually carry this forward. The offer that they're going to make to people and that they end up making is they start traveling around Europe, starting off in some areas in Italy and Greece, and they're offering people passage to British East Florida. They're saying, look, we're going to take you, we're going to stage you on the island of Minorca. We're going to put you up there, we're going to feed you and house you. We're going to pay to get you to British East Florida. And once you're there, you're going to work for a period of time under an indenture, and then you're going to be given land, and you're going to become a landowner in this new area where you're going to create this plantation. And I don't know if it's maybe sounds too good to be true. He initially struggles with getting some Greek people to join him. He gets a few, but he doesn't think he's going to have enough. They start spreading out their efforts. And as they're staging people on the island of Minorca, I think the unexpected nature of the way this is going to go starts to manifest itself early. He underestimates the response from the people on the island of Minorca. And as the word gets out of this offer to work sweat equity your way into becoming a landowner, more and more people start joining Turnbull's settlement idea from the island of Minorca. It takes them so long to get this together. Some of the Italians they first brought are marrying women on the island, and families are on their way by the time they get these people gathered up. Some other Greeks start to show up and join them. And the investors in Turnbull, I think Turnbull, the eternal optimist, he sees this as an opportunity. The more people they have, the more land they can ask for from the British Crown, and it just increases the size of their holdings at that point. And so he talks to the investors, they add ships, they plan for more, and by the time they actually get ready to start across the Atlantic, there's Turnbull's main investor and financial backer, Sir William Duncan, and his wife, Lady Duncan. By the time Turnbull leaves and heads out across the Atlantic, he reports to his investors he's got over 1,400 people on board 8 vessels, along with an unaccounted number of stowaways that he says he really doesn't know exactly how many or who all those people are. We know that likely at least, if not over half of them, were Minorcan people that had joined him from Minorca. The numbers estimate somewhere around 500 of them that were Greek that had joined them along the way. There's a couple hundred Italians and some other mixed European people within there. One of the things that starts to manifest itself quickly, even after the realization that it's taking longer to recruit, is everything Turnbull plans, he seems to overlook planning for the unexpected. He doesn't factor that in, really, to anything. It takes them longer to recruit the people than he expects it's going to. It takes them longer to cross the Atlantic than he expects that it's going to. It takes much longer for the settlers to acclimate here in Florida than he expects it to, and certainly takes much longer for the settlement to get to the point that it could even have the chance to realize some profitability than they project in the very beginning. And I think something that's notable is that no one has done this before. There's no playbook. I mean, sure, people have created settlements in other areas, but not in central North Florida, on the east coast of Florida they haven't. And it's a completely new environment that is ready to test not only those who are making the plans, but most certainly the people that get caught up in being a part of that plan as well. Governor James Grant is the governor of St. Augustine, and he's certainly an ally of Turnbull's. Although, when you look at the letters from the past, Grant rises to the surface as the one person that seems to have a little bit of common sense and some real skepticism on the fact that this is going to go as they expect it to go. In one of his writings later on, he says he fears that if Turnbull even misses a payment to his investors, they're just going to cut off the money, and all these poor people are going to starve in East Florida. And so he's a little worried about how this is going to go before people even start arriving. And in July 26th of 1768, the people start arriving from Europe. It's a Sunday, actually, and over 200 of them have died on board the ships trying to get here to Florida. Turnbull has greatly underestimated the impacts of weather and how long it's going to take for them to actually get here. The settlers start making their way to New Smyrna, and it's very ill prepared to receive them. There's not enough food, there's not enough housing for that many people. The work has to begin almost immediately if they're going to be successful. People have to start clearing fields. They have to start figuring out how they're going to spread their resources to account for the extra people that they have. And as it turns out, it's not November, it's July, in an area that the Spanish named the Bar of the Mosquitoes and Rio de Mosquitoes. And you know, depending on what time the rains start, that's what triggers the salt marsh mosquitoes. And if you've ever read that book, A Land Remembered, those eggs lay dormant through the dry season, and when the rains hit, clouds of these things would rise from the swamps here in Florida, thick enough that cattle would drown trying to breathe in the clouds of these mosquitoes. Yellow fever is very prevalent. It's probably a good thing that Turnbull didn't recruit as many Greek people as he really wanted to. The Greek population carries a genetic blood disorder called thalassemia, and if they got yellow fever, it was a death sentence. They were not going to survive that. And we know that hundreds of the settlers died in the first 18 months that they were there in New Smyrna. The question I know that both Dr. Grange and Dorothy Moore had about that, I don't know what button I just hit. And the question that Dr. Grange and Dot Moore had about that was whether Turnbull actually knew why people were getting sick. He was a doctor. He knew people were ill, but all the research on the mosquito as a disease vector isn't done for over 100 years later, when malaria is actually studied. And so there are some questions as to how they would have really dealt with that. Turnbull talks about a tempest, he says, a tropical storm that hits them in those early months. He's hired overseers from slave plantations to the north, and there are some slaves on the settlement there helping, although Turnbull writes that he's worried that the presence of the slaves is going to tarnish the character of what he's trying to create. I think that was probably the least of his worries. He also appoints some of the indentured people to be overseers over the other people that are there. And mistreatment is the result of all of these endeavors. And it's a relatively short period of time before there's an early rebellion at the Turnbull settlement. And the story is that Turnbull had left to visit a plantation between New Smyrna and St. Augustine. A supply ship had come in, and one of the larger, more formidable Italian men rises up against the head overseer and basically takes out his frustration on this guy. He's joined by others, and they overpower the overseers at the Turnbull settlement. That head overseer, they cut off his ear and a couple of fingers. They break into a storehouse that's storing goods for the settlement. They remove the goods from that. They commandeer this supply ship that's come in. They load the goods on the ship, kill a cow so they've got something to eat. And the plan is to take the ship and the goods, make it to Havana, and trade all of that to the Spanish because they want to go home. And there is writings that not one of the Minorcan people who had joined the settlement joined in that early rebellion. And it's also said that the Greeks and Italians were really quite frustrated with them and treated them quite harshly over the fact that they would not turn their back on the agreement that they had made with Turnbull in those early days. I think the downfall of that whole rebellion is rum, believe it or not. They find a cask of rum in the warehouse, and instead of just putting it on board the ship and celebrating when they get to Havana, they open it up and they start consuming it right away, and it delays their departure by at least a tide cycle or two. And somebody loyal to Turnbull gets him a message. He gets a message to Governor Grant. And by the time this ship makes it to the Mosquito Inlet with the right tide to escape, there are 2 British ships sitting there waiting to intercept them. There's a good portion of them that bail off the ships. all of the ship there. Quite a few of them are caught on board and taken back. It's said that the people that escape on foot and flee to the south, within a few weeks, they are frantically waving down, trying to get the attention of a passing ship so that they can be collected up. There is nothing to the south of New Smyrna except other humans that don't want to see you at that point in time. And these people are being eaten by bugs and pursued, and they want to make it back to safety. In the trials that follow here in St. Augustine, Turnbull actually defends the bulk of the settlers. He says those people are followers. Those men rose up and they represented themselves as leadership, and those people did what I would expect people to do when someone says they have their best interest at heart. And I think on the other side of that coin, Turnbull probably didn't want to lose more workers from the fields in that whole incident. There are 3 individuals who are convicted to die. One of them for piracy, taking control of that ship. Another one for murder. It's the tropics. The guy they cut up so bad gets infected. He doesn't survive. The third individual is convicted to die for killing the cow that's loaded on board. It's a capital offense at that point in time on British soil, but a caveat in British law allows Governor Grant to suspend the lowest sentence and allow that person, if they agree, to act as royal executioner of the others. And after agreeing, the written account of that has this individual really becoming quite emotionally distraught. And only after the encouragement from the people that are going to be executed, for them telling him to compose himself and do what he has to do, does he take the lives of the people who he had befriended to earn the right to go back to New Smyrna and go back to work basically on the settlement. It was certainly a different time for human rights in the late 1700s. The native people of Florida are also still a factor here at that point in time. There's a story of Turnbull's settlers at one of the cow pens there at the settlement, and a well-known Indian chief by the name of Cowkeeper shows up with some of the members of his tribe, and they hear them talking, and they swear that they're Spanish. And they beat a couple of these guys up pretty bad before they're able to get the whole thing settled down. Turnbull has to travel with Cowkeeper here to St. Augustine and meet with Governor Grant to help him understand that the people that he's encountering aren't Spanish people. They might look like the Spanish, and they may sound a little bit like the Spanish, but they're actually with the British people that are here, and that they don't need to be attacked every time you come across them. And they do initially settle that down. The sum of the story of the Turnbull settlement really, I think, is nowhere near as pleasant as the graphic that shows up on the screen that was done for our settlement exhibit. There's maybe some success during the settlement from the investor's perspective. They do ship over 10,000 pounds of indigo on 1 year, but it results in nowhere near enough money to pay off the debts of the settlement and start to clear that up. And besides all that, somebody has to make all that indigo, which if you've looked at that process at all, it's just absolutely horrible. And the people are languishing under these conditions. There's also been very little investment in them as a workforce over these years. And when we see letters that Turnbull has written back to the investors, when he's pleading on behalf of the settlers, it's usually not so that something can be done to improve their well-being and their overall lifestyle at the settlement. It's to buy enough food to keep them healthy and working in the fields. The emphasis stays on making the settlement profitable on behalf of the investors. The work basically stays hard, the food stays scarce, and the treatment ranges from being heavy-handed to just outright murderous in some of the explanations. Now, Governor Tonin replaces Governor Grant here in St. Augustine in 1774, and Turnbull loses his ally. And some of those letters later on in Grant's writings, you almost wonder if his health doesn't start to fail from the stress of seeing what's going on to the south. He's a loyal governor, though. He does the best he can. But when he's replaced by Governor Tonin, Turnbull has lost an ally. And Tonin has no love for Turnbull at all, nor the clique of other Turnbull allies that have been put in key positions here in British East Florida. And at the same time, Sir William Duncan dies that same year. Turnbull loses his primary financial investor. Also, the relationship, the Crown's relationship with the colonies to the north of Florida has been deteriorating practically from the time the settlement is established. And by the time you start getting to those later years, those problems are really coming to a head. The story of the collapse of the Turnbull settlement actually has a young Minorcan boy, his last name is Arnau, hearing a couple of businessmen in New Smyrna that are visiting from St. Augustine. He hears them make a comment that if the people at the settlement knew how deplorable the conditions were, that they would go to the governor and have something done about the Turnbull settlement. And it's said that people are wearing rags at this point in time. They're still underfed. There's been nothing invested to take care of them. Some historians in modern history have speculated that Tonin may have orchestrated that loud conversation in front of some of the settlers to basically spur that process on. I don't know that there's any way to quantify that actual speculation. The young man, of course, goes home and tells the adults in his life. They put together a plan, and several able-bodied men make it unnoticed to St. Augustine and meet with representatives of the governor. The stories they tell are horrific. When people go after 9 years and ask for their land grants, they say, we signed indenture contracts for 6 years or 8 years, and when we asked for our land, we were beaten severely, and in some cases isolated, and food and water was held from us, and then we were thrown back in the field and told to go back to work. And so you can see where there's an effort to deter that type of interaction that's going on there at the settlement in the depositions that are being shared. Tonin sends some troops back to New Smyrna with those initial men that came up. They gather some other people, and this succession of people coming to New Smyrna, or to St. Augustine, and giving depositions about their treatment takes place, which eventually results in Governor Tonin dissolving the settlement, dissolving the contracts of the indentured. It's said that he offers those people New Smyrna. He says, you all built it, you worked for it, you can take it, but they did not want to come back to New Smyrna. There were likely people loyal to Turnbull at that time. By then, what's going on in the colonies to the north of Florida is becoming an issue as well. And so the British soldiers have been pulled back to St. Augustine. And so you see this exodus where we know that over 600 people that were left basically used the old King's Highway to travel to the north and reestablish their lives here in St. Augustine. A little part of the story that's generally not told is of the slave population that was there. They were simply assets of the plantation holders, and they lived out the rest of their lives in captivity, probably sold to some other plantation during that point in time. Something else we don't know about the settlement is where the over 900 people who perished during the years of the settlement are actually buried. And when the state of Florida first started putting together their historic archives, there's a discussion that they decided not to invest any money in doing historical research into New Smyrna because they felt that there had been so many years of pioneer settlement over the top of it that there was likely nothing left to actually find. Dot Moore proved them wrong when she found that first settler's home site. Now there's big impacts on north central Florida and certainly New Smyrna as a result of that British period here. The Old King's Road, this is actually a map that was created during the Second Seminole Indian War. It shows both of the canals coming off the river there in New Smyrna, the North and South Canal. You can see the Old King's Road coming down, the Old King's Road to St. Augustine, and ironically enough, every one of those other trails that runs to the north are all labeled Trail to St. Augustine. Every one of them. It's really the only place to go north of New Smyrna at that point in time. It's actually Florida's first formal road, said to be Britain's largest engineering project at the time. Something else that's created is the Turnbull Canal system. It's first created to drain and create agricultural property at the time. It's the first canal system that's developed in the state of Florida to create agricultural land. Another big player in New Smyrna's history is Turnbull's Wharf. Turnbull, there's a representation. This is a blown up image from that map of the settlement that was recovered. But there's a representation of a ship coming into the stone wharf. There's the 2 rows of coquina stone blocks that extended out into the river at the wharf site there in New Smyrna. It establishes a fantastic shipping channel for New Smyrna. And when you pair the Old Kings Road and the canals and the wharf and Mosquito Inlet and the access to the Atlantic, it ties together one of the next best places south of St. Augustine to start an agricultural endeavor as history moves forward. We play a big role as a result of that in the plantation era. As a matter of fact, the sugar mills ruins that you see there and the activities in New Smyrna land New Smyrna on UNESCO's World Heritage Sites of ports that were involved in the slave trade, right along with St. Augustine and Charleston and Savannah here in North America. The Second Seminole War, Turnbull's Wharf also plays a big role in when Fort New Smyrna is established, and they use the wharf to load supplies out of the fort and build more forts to the south. During the Civil War, again, Turnbull's Wharf still exists, and there's this story of the gladiator that shows up in Nassau, and everybody knows it's loaded with weapons for the Confederacy, but they don't know where it's going to come in. The Union Navy's choked off the ports to the north, and Secretary of War Benjamin hires a company out of Charleston. They offload that ship and break it down into small loads, and they smuggle 10,000 Enfield rifles and offload them right at Turnbull's Wharf and store them in a warehouse behind that wharf and ferry them on to the north towards Lake City. The wharf and the waterway prove advantageous enough that it eventually brings about the destruction of New Smyrna when the Union Navy destroys New Smyrna. And we think that wharf as well. That's a photo of Jane Sheldon looking back at her boarding house hotel after it was destroyed by the Union Navy in July of 1863. However, the wharf's gone today. The Old Kings Road has been largely lost to development. But Turnbull's Canal System, built over 250 years ago, continues to be an important part of New Smyrna's stormwater management system. It was initially constructed to create agriculture, and today it supports neighborhoods down towards the river in the older part of New Smyrna. Some other great old colorized images. Just to follow up as I wrap up on the announcement that Payson shared with us. Coming up in 2027, an event that we've collaborated closely with the Minorcan Experience, and we have Lee Craig of the Minorcan Experience here with us tonight, and Ann Browning Masters, both of them members of the Minorcan Experience and the Minorcan Cultural Society. Ann is also the Poet Laureate for St. Augustine. I'm so glad that you're here to join us tonight. But we've been working for some time now on this event called Journey to Freedom, Florida's Untold Minorcan Story. And it's going to play out between March 13th and March 20th. And we've been working closely with the Minorcan Experience, St. Photios, and the Minorcan Cultural Society. And we look forward in the coming months to share more with you about what that's going to look like next year. Thank you so much for having me with you.
So, I'm not necessarily an expert either.
But I am a Minorcan, and used to teach English. But over the years, of course, the Minorcan story is unfolded in, as I've lived in St. Augustine now for close to 40 years. And yes, I get to tell the happier part of the Minorcan story. But New Smyrna arguably has the more dramatic half of the story. So, but as some of my fiction writing friends say, you know, only trouble is interesting. But I would like to argue that it's cathartic and inspiring to see success. And so that's what my part of the presentation is about tonight. So I want to start off by saying the Minorcans have been the backbone of the city of St. Augustine for 250 years. Today you can find Minorcan names throughout St. Augustine and St. Johns County. If you look on the back of your brochure, you'll see the 48 Minorcan names in that green sort of bubble at the bottom half. The 48 Minorcan names that were still here in 1975 when, in 76, when we were celebrating the bicentennial, okay? But there were over 250 Minorcan families originally, at least. And, but today you can still find Minorcan names on the businesses in town. Think of Leonardi's Nursery, Master's Land Clearing. The house across the street from me right now has Master's Land Clearing, demolishing the neighbor's house, and they're doing a very delicate job of it too. You know, it's amazing. I thought it'd be all sort of, you know, clawed and torn apart, but you know, they saved the bricks, they saved the windows. You know, it's very nice. And, you know, yay, Minorcans. There's streets, right, all over St. Augustine that bear Minorcan names. There's Genevar Street. One of my favorites is St. Andrew's Court. I'm sorry, Genevar's Road, and that's up near Lowe's. There are tourist attractions like the Ximenez-Fatio house and the Genopoly Schoolhouse. All Minorcan names, still in St. Augustine, and many, many, many more. Among the 30,000 Minorcans in St. Johns County, as Payson said, you know, 1 in 10 folks in St. Johns County has Minorcan ancestry. And so, you know, but a lot of people don't even know it because the families have married in and out of the Minorcan names. So there are Minorcan names in town, not on this little list. You know, the name Michler is Minorcan by marriage. The name DuPont Center, Minorcan by marriage. Bravo, Stratton, Weedman, I could go on and on. And sometimes those people who marry into the Minorcan community, like my mom and my husband David Nolan, are the most enthusiastic Minorcans. They're the ones who are into it. I am, yes. But he really is. It's amazing. In the summer of 1777, most of the Minorcans who were left in New Smyrna, at least 500 of them, fled New Smyrna for the ancient city, walked those 70 miles up here. 4 days, 3 nights. On the staff of the Ximenez-Fatio house is Ryan Brennan. He has reenacted this 70-mile walk from New Smyrna to St. Augustine twice now. But when they arrived in St. Augustine, the Minorcans' hard luck began to change for better in a number of ways. First, let's see, I think I have another slide for you. Yeah. In St. Augustine, East Florida Governor Patrick Tonin was happy to have the additional able-bodied Minorcans available to him here in St. Augustine. He needed militiamen to bolster his troops. He had asked Turnbull at one point, Turnbull replied in the letter, you know, I think I have about 200 people who could, who could help out. For sure, but Tonin also needed laborers to provide food for people in town. And so, you know, the Minorcans were expert fishermen and farmers. And Tonin was rightly worried about an attack from the American forces in Georgia, just north of his British border. And indeed, there were attacks on Florida in the near future during the Revolutionary War. Second, another reason Tonin, well, a second benefit for Minorcans, when the Revolutionary War did end in 1783, the territory of Florida was returned to the Spanish by the newly formed U.S. as a reward to its ally. So, one of the upsides for the Minorcans was the British would be evacuating St. Augustine. And all those homes and farms and businesses were kind of available. And the Minorcans had been living in palmetto thatched huts again up here in St. Augustine. And so they were able to move into some very nicely, recently built British homes. Another upside for the Minorcans, you'll see this map that Greg had up here earlier, the Delary map, that shows the Turnbull settlement. Along the green line in the middle, you'll just above it, you'll see little red dots. I know it's really hard to see, it's very small. But those are the houses that the palmetto thatched huts, later some housing, that the Minorcans lived in New Smyrna. They were they were located all on the riverfront for 8 miles along the riverfront. They were about 300 yards from each other. Okay, so you know, some 1,250 Minorcans living in duplexes along the waterfront, 8-mile stretch. So if you got some friends and family, you know, down in St. Augustine shores, and you live in St. Augustine, you know, I mean, it's the equivalent, right? That's quite a stretch. And so the Minorcans, the Mediterraneans, the Greeks, the Italians, the Minorcans, a few Corsican, a couple Frenchmen, they were used to living in clusters of communities. And so now back in St. Augustine, they could do that again. Whoops. Don't want to leave out father camps, but so I was going to take you to, whoops, all right, let's stay with father camps here. We'll get to the clusters of communities in just a minute here in St. Augustine. So another benefit for the Minorcans sort of occupying St. Augustine after the British left, under Spanish rule, the Minorcans could easily practice their Catholicism. The saintly father camps, and he really must have been, had kept them spiritually alive. And when he died in 1790, 13 years after they had walked up here, he was performing, as I'd like to argue, yet a few more miracles for the Minorcans from above, with the new housing and all this great opportunity. So the Minorcans settled in the north part of the city of St. Augustine. You'll see that darker area with the heavier lining around an old city map. You know, there's the fort, that starred sort of shape in the bottom right corner. And so the Minorcans settled in what is really St. Augustine's tourist district. And it used to be called the Minorcan Quarter. It's on all kind of maps, the Minorcan Quarter. That has disappeared. I wish it could come back. At least references and acknowledgments of this. Today, there's still a few pockets of the Minorcan Quarter you can find around town. For example, just a block west of St. George Street, okay, there's this beautiful little residential area that's still occupied by Minorcan families, the Pellissiers, the Michlers, and more. You know, not too far are some Andrews live around the corner. But the street name is Spanish Street. Not Minorcan Street. But note, you know, on this beautiful little street, how the buildings carry that Spanish and Minorcan design. They're high walls that are flush to the street, right? And that was for defensive purposes, so that to prevent access to the interior of the house from the road. And the high walls also created a kind of privacy because within there was an enclosed courtyard, there were gardens, and the well, you wouldn't want the well to be poisoned, that was behind those high walls too. And this architectural style has become known, you know, if people want to build in sort of the old Spanish Minorcan style, as the St. Augustine plan. And the St. Augustine plan was outlined in this book, The Houses of St. Augustine. Okay, written by a Minorcan architect and historian. He was not an architect, he was a historian. Albert Manussi. All right, and that was written in 1960. In 1786, when the Minorcans shortly after the Minorcans arrived in St. Augustine and began to live in nicer houses. These are two rebuilt houses that were designed. The one on the right is the Michler house. The one on the left, just the edge of it, the orange edge of it, you see is a Pellissier house. And both of those were designed by a Minorcan architect, Les Thomas. He is an Andreu descendant. And still designing many things in town today. He just has designed the wonderful amphitheater, you know, the Ponte Vedra Concert Center. I could go on. Those are just some of the few things he has done, and you know, keeping it within the character of the community as a lifelong Minorcan that he is can do. And so, but the average household back then. Had about 4 people. There were 152 Minorcan households, and so average house had about 4 people. Women often married by 15. Many couples, there were second marriages, usually, if not third marriages, because you know a spouse had died in New Smyrna or on the way over. People died in childbirth, and so typically the daily ritual was. The men would travel out around the city, leave the city and go out to rented fields and farm, or go out and fish. And then in the evening, return home to their clusters of community. This little community is called San Felipe, Little San Felipe, named after an area in Minorca where these people had, you know, their ancestors had come from and had lived. So go visit this. This is sweet. I love that area. Eventually, those land leases became land grants and land purchases by the Minorcans. So again, all around the city boundaries, north, south, and west of St. Augustine. So I know this map is really hard to see, but I'll try to describe it. Beginning in, so it was in 1790, the same year that the Saintly Father Camps died, the British began to be willing to give the Minorcan settlers the land grants that they never got down in New Smyrna. And so they said, you know, they were like, hey, these are built-in settlers who know how to thrive in this Florida wilderness. And so what you have here is a map of the North River settlements that are, you know, beyond the Volano Bridge, okay, up there at the Guanatolamato Reserve, okay? And the heavy lining there, even with a magnifying glass, I really can't read the writing in there. But just below in the first quadrant, see there's sort of stripes below it, those are land grants for each family. So the first land grant below the heavy lining is, it says, the widow and heirs of Juan Andrew. That's about 160 acres. And that's one of my greats from way back. On this map, you'll also see Minorcan names like a Segui tract, another Andrew tract, and down here in the left corner, Lee, that's a Capot tract. Yeah. So the land there in that area, you know, in Guana, I always call it Guana State Park, but I know it has a much longer formal name, Guano Tolomato Reserve and something. It's incredibly beautiful. In the way that Princess Place and Palliser Creek south of town, I don't know if you've been to those areas, you know, this beautiful oak hammock area that I used to love running out there. And I would run the trails all around, and there's tons of wildlife. There's, you know, deer, of course, wild pig, and plenty of turkey. And I love the land, even before I knew I was related to anybody that ever lived there. Juan Andrew, again, that quadrant just below the heavy lining. Today, if you walk from at the south entrance of Guana out to the intercoastal, that waterway there, the ocean is on the far right, and then there's an inland waterway, the Tolomato River, the North River. You can, Shell Bluff is, overlooks the intercoastal. So that's still today. There's a Minorcan well out there that I need to follow up and find out what they did with it, because it was being eroded by the encroaching water from the intercoastal. But not only did these Minorcan become landholders, they even became slaveholders. And so, you know, turning around 13 years later from having been, in a sense, enslaved of sorts, yeah, so just want to make sure we acknowledge that. Juan Andrew had 5 slaves. One of the more successful Minorcans of this Florida territorial time was General Joseph Hernandez. He was a descendant of the Turnbull New Smyrna colony. He was born in St. Augustine, and at age 20, he married well. His wife's former husband was a prominent sugar planter and had owned large tracts of land in the Palm Coast and Daytona area. His best-known plantation today is Malacompra at Bing's Landing, south of town, where they have that amazing barbecue, you know, there at Captain's. Malacompra is Spanish, to translate it means bad bargain. You know, Hernandez had a sense of humor. And, but it was mainly a cotton plantation. And Hernandez became famous to us today for being the first territorial delegate sent to represent Florida in Congress. Okay? Also the first Hispanic member of Congress. Hernandez became infamous for leading the 1837 expedition that captured the Seminole leader Osceola under the white flag of truce. This happened near present-day Treaty Park. If you want to go take a look, there's the marker is behind Treaty Park on the southwest side in the neighborhood. Hernandez survived this military scandal. He became mayor of St. Augustine, and he died in Cuba just before the Civil War on his son's sugar plantation. They decided to leave St. Augustine because something bad had happened to the price of sugar. We're all familiar with that word tariff? Yeah. Another Minorcan Hispanic American first is the story of Maria Andreu. She belonged to one of the Minorcan families who left the farming and fishing world for her family family, Juan Andrew took a government job as a lighthouse keeper. But Minorcan families at that time, they were moving into positions like riverboat pilots and bridge tenders. I have all those ancestors. Just 2 weeks ago, the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, thanks to members Beth Pelzer and Diana Kaiser, they're out there, yeah, taking care of things. Successfully nominated Maria Andreu as one of the outstanding 250 women we should be aware of in this year of the American 250th. So Maria Andreu was my father's great-great-grandmother. She was one of the first women lighthouse keepers and the first Hispanic lighthouse keeper. All this came to her through some bad luck. Her husband, who had been the light keeper of not the present day lighthouse that we see in St. Augustine. Before that, there was a watchtower, okay, that washed away, eroded away, and so another one was built back, further, and became today's lighthouse. He was let's see. Her husband fell to his death while whitewashing the tower, and since she was one of the few people who had seen up close over a period of 4 years how things operate, she was appointed the lighthouse keeper for the next 2.5 years until the light was extinguished for fear that the Union troops coming in to Florida would commandeer it and use it to their benefit. So another Minorcan success story, I talk about these people a lot, I hope you're not, you're willing to hear it once again, is the Benet family. There, multiple generations of the Benet family, even still today, who are quite amazing. Pedro Benet, known informally as King of the Minorcans here in St. Augustine, he was a leader during that difficult Spanish to American transition. His son, in the middle there, Stephen Vincent Benet, was promoted to general after the Civil War. He had been Lincoln's key advisor in regard to cannon weaponry. And General Benet's, the middle guy's grandson, another Stephen Vincent Benet, was a beloved American writer in the first half of the 20th century. He was awarded 2 Pulitzer Prizes for his poetry, the first for his book, John Brown's Body. It's a book-length Civil War poem that was popular and recitable in the way that we love Hamilton today. I've met people on a walk through Anastasia State Park who recited, out of John Brown's Body, long passages. I was like, really? I have to learn that in school. Today, Stephen Vincent Benet's best known work is The Devil and Daniel Webster, a little short story that has been adapted in many ways for movies, plays, songs like Charlie Daniels, The Devil Went Down to Georgia. So, as Florida became a warm weather retreat, some Minorcans decided to capitalize on St. Augustine tourism. For example, in 1870, Philip Capot, a Minorcan heritage native, opened one of St. Augustine's more picturesque and popular waterfront attractions, the Capot Bathhouse. It was located on the seawall right across from today's Hilton Hotel. It was octagonal in structure, built of wood on a coquina foundation, and it offered, as they said, every convenience for hot or cold seawater or sulfur baths. In a 1930 interview in the St. Augustine Record, one businessman remembered that in those days, in the late 19th century, the beaches were rather inaccessible, but Capot's bathhouse provided a place to swim right here in the city. The painter of the image on the right is James Calvert Smith, and he remembered the gender-segregated swimming times. The men could bathe at Capot's when the tide was near its height, and the women and the children could bathe at Capot's when the tide was going out. And there was, it doesn't show it on the image on the left, but I've seen other drawings and sketches that show above that turret kind of, there was a pole that had a little ball that would sort of drop and raise, you know, as the tides designated whose turn it was to swim there. So the Capot's bathhouse burned in the monumental 1914 St. Augustine fire that destroyed many downtown structures. One of the great disasters in St. Augustine history, right? Another Minorcan entertainment structure that burned in the Great Fire of 1914 was Bartolo Genovar's Florida House and Opera House on St. George Street. Currently, and surprisingly, we have no drawings of the Opera House. What you're looking at there is the Florida Hotel, okay? But you can see on the left of that image, probably the edge of the Opera House. And so, if you can go through your family albums from way back when, or, you know, and see, I mean, you know, no known images right now of the Genovar's Opera House. And it has such an amazing history. Whoops, got ahead of myself here. Bartolo Genovar had succeeded Pedro Benet as actually the third king of the Minorcans. Genovar believed St. Augustine needed a dignified place to have entertainment. He built an opera house that could seat about 700 people. And it was the first place in the ancient city to show moving pictures, you know, on a regular basis. And all sorts of entertainment was staged there over the years. There were celebrities like gentleman Jim Corbett, the world heavyweight boxing champion, who came to Genovar's Opera House, and he was moonlighting as an actor. John Philip Sousa's band performed there. And in 1889, the Opera House hosted the great Frederick Douglass, the Black orator and abolitionist, and you can see a historic marker that marks that 1890 visit by Frederick Douglass right on St. George Street in front of Prohibition Kitchen. So if you go take a look, yeah, it's really special. Another Minorcan business that benefited from tourism was Cooley's St. Augustine Transfer Company. Okay, Cooley is an old Florida family name. One of those that intermarried with the Minorcans, in the Passetti family more specifically, in the 1800s. And so today, most Cooleys are considered Minorcans, like the Bravos and the Michelers and so on. And we'll claim anybody. But L.A. Cooley, Louis Cooley, and his father started the St. Augustine Transfer Company in 1887. And it was Cooley who said that he had given Henry Flagler his first ride around town, first carriage ride around town before Flagler decided to build his hotel. Later, the St. Augustine Transfer Company was one of the main carriage lines that brought visitors and their luggage to and from Flagler's Hotel Ponce de Leon. Excuse me. Even our alligator farm has Minorcan heritage. In 1937, F. Charles Ximenez, Minorcan descendant, and his business partner, W.I. Drysdale, on the left there, in the picture on the left, so Drysdale and Ximenez, purchased the St. Augustine Alligator Farm and made it a go-to attraction. Charles Ximenez was also a state representative for 11 terms from 1943 until his death in 1966. If you drive in and out of town on State Road 16, you'll see that there's a marker there that says it's named for F. Charles Ximenez. It's the Memorial Highway. Let's see. The Ximenez family still owns and operates the St. Augustine Scenic Cruise boats and leave from the bayfront, as well as the North Beach Campground up on Volano and Aunt Kate's Restaurant. Okay? And the origin of the restaurant actually goes back a century or more to when Henry Flagler asked the Ximenez, who were known for their wonderful cuisine, to provide an oyster roast for his guests on his yacht. But of course, the most well-known thing, can't have a discussion of anything Minorcan without talking about the dapple pepper, right? But the most well-known Minorcan American thing is actually not from Minorca. Okay? The Minorcan dowel pepper is not from Minorca. It was imported to St. Augustine in 1880 from Cuba. And the Minorcans adopted it. We kind of hybridized it. They were only ones, sort of taking care of it and continuing to, plant it from year to year. And now the dowel pepper is truly uniquely Minorcan in St. Augustine. I mean, it does grow in other places. I have friends trying to grow it right now in Arizona. And people use it for all kind of wonderful products and jams, right? And clam chowders. And it's really our thing. It is truly, Minorcan American. So, to close, this is a sign you can find in Mayport, which is where some Minorcans sort of migrated to. My folks, Andrews are up that way, and so I go up there from time to time. But as we think about next year, as Payson said, 2027, which will be the 250th anniversary of the Minorcans in St. Augustine, who have been a background citizenry. New Smyrna kindly had a 250th for Minorcans in Florida and New Smyrna 9 years ago. It would be really nice to establish some kind of public Minorcan exhibit. Tell me where that is. It's not here in St. Augustine that I know of. It's not in the visitor center, not on St. George Street, unless you go in St. Photios and the Greek shrine. The Greeks are so good at, trying to help us remember the Minorcan story. So I would love to see in some kind of public and free venue, for example, a mural that tells the Minorcan story. Some kind of interpretive exhibit. Secondly, I would love to see reprinted Jane Quinn's book, Minorcans in Florida. It's out of print, published in 1975. And it's the only one of the major sort of scholarly Minorcan books that carries the Minorcan story beyond, that dramatic and amazing, the Turnbull years in New Smyrna. I should say Pat Griffin brings the story forward into the 1780s and talks about some of the Minorcan customs and rituals and things like that. But Jane Quinn brings it forward to 1975. And that's an important part of the story. It tells the story of the Benets and Hernandez and so forth. Third, I would sure like to see sainthood for Father Camps, a beginning of a campaign for Father Camps. I mean, churches in St. Augustine and New Smyrna, and Greg, didn't you meet the bishop of Minorca? Yeah, it's like falling into place. It takes a long time for sainthood to happen. But if we don't start now, it's even further down the road. So finally, the Minorcan story is a very American story. It's not, it's not, of course, the only story of immigration and resilience and cultural contribution. And it's emblematic of probably most of our stories, our backgrounds here tonight. So someday, I hope the Minorcans of Florida will be as well known to us all throughout the nation as the Cajuns of Louisiana. So thanks a lot. Appreciate your efforts to be here, and